Good evening.
Good evening.
How you all are?
Thank you for that incredibly delayed reaction. Okay, we're still in Hosea. We're gonna be in Hosea for a long time. It's a long book. I mean, compared to the other minor prophets, it's long. We're basically covering all of chapter 2, with the exception of verse 1 that we covered last week. Their sort of natural breaking point would be after verse 15, because you sort of wrap up. There's three, repeated phrase 3 times, and then after verse 15, it sort of jumps into something else. So we'll go ahead and read verses 2 through 15, and then get into that. So starting in verse 2, bring charges against your mother. Bring charges, for she is not my wife, nor am I her husband. Let her put away her harlotries from her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked, and expose her, as in the day when she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst. I will not have mercy on her children, for they are the children of harlotry. For their mother has played the harlot, she who conceived them has behaved shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up your way with thorns and wall her in, so that she cannot find her paths. She will chase her lovers, but will not overtake them. Yes, she will seek them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then it was better for me than now. For she did not know that I gave her grain, new wine, and oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal. Therefore I will return and take away my grain in its time, and my new wine in its season, and will take back my wool and my linen, given to cover her nakedness. Now I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall deliver her from my hand. I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons, her Sabbaths, all her appointed feasts. And I will destroy her vine and her fig trees, of which she said, These are my wages that my lovers have given me. So I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. I will punish her for the days of the Baals to which she burned incense. She decked herself with earrings and jewelry, and went after her lovers, but she forgot, says the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, will bring her into the wilderness, and speak comfort to her. I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of hope. She shall sing there, as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. So that was, it was only like 14 verses, but there were some long verses, and also, prophecy is often, it seems long, even if it's really not that long. But I guess sort of starting from the top, we have several people, not really, that are being called out. We have mother, we have wife, and we have children. Simple enough. But I put the word people in those little, quotations, because, obviously, I mean, this is symbolic, not actually, bringing charges against someone's mom. And 2 of these people are actually sort of the same person functioning in different ways. To the people being addressed, this woman is a mother, but to the one who's addressing the people, this woman is a wife. And to make things even more confusing, this mother-wife figure also is the children. So it's all kind of the same person being called out, which kind of makes things more confusing. Right, Israel is portrayed, and I think, this is your blank. Israel is portrayed here as a mother and a wife that births children of harlotry. Okay, so, right, Israel is the mother, Israel is the wife, and obviously they're giving birth to children of harlotry, so their children are also Israel as well. In other words, right, as far as the children part goes, right, Israel's sort of raising up the next generation to be idolatrous, just as the current generation is idolatrous. Israel, as a group, as a whole, they're sort of being brought to court, and they're instructed to bring charges against their mother, right? Bring charges against your own people, right? And to God, this is right spoken of as a wife, like I said, and God promises that He's not going to have mercy on, not only the promiscuous mother, this promiscuous wife's children. Don't try to read like too much into this allegory of the whole like family dynamic and bringing charges. We can't necessarily infer that just because people are told to bring charges against other people, that this is being addressed to like the faithful remnant and they're supposed to bring charges against the unfaithful people. We can't really determine that from this passage. Israel is the witness, but they're also being called out here, right? They're encouraged to witness against or condemn their own people, but in the same sense, they're also condemning themselves. And your little blank is the witness becomes or is the same as the defendant. So moving on to verse 5, we have the description of Baal worship. That's another one of your blanks. This is a quote. It says, the text alludes to the principal alleged benefit of Baal worship, which is fertility, right? The Baals, they were often fertility gods. You worship them and you can have lots of children. Makes sense given the context of the whole children birth through harlotry idea. Also, another quote from the same guy, he says, numerous offerings and agricultural prosperity were the two compensations or payment that the fertility cults promised their worshipers, right? The offerings and the agricultural prosperity that we see in verse 5, the bread, the water, the wool, the linen, the oil, the drink, all that. I mean, that lines up with what was associated with Baal worship at that time. Baal worship during this time wasn't exactly, the official state religion of Israel, but it was pretty widespread, and it was often intertwined with or syncretized, right? Talk about religious syncretism, sort of a mixing of Baal worship and, worship of the true God into sort of this weird mixture of, we're doing some stuff that's like commanded in the Torah, but we're also like doing it in an altar to Baal, or maybe we're at an altar to Baal and we're doing stuff that we would be doing at like the temple. And it was just sort of this weird syncretistic mix of like Baal worship and Yahweh worship. So going on into verse 6, this is where the proclamation of punishment begins. And this is where we get the 3 therefores, right? In verse 6, verse 9, and verse 14. So I sort of broke it down for you, A, B, C, verse 6, verse 9, verse 14. So starting with verse 6, this uses language of an animal in captivity. And it's been noted that this has been fulfilled, in part at least, with the Assyrian conquest and the Assyrian exile of Israel. In verse 8, we actually have direct reference to Baal. For she did not know that I gave her grain, new wine, and oil, multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal. right? All of the offerings that Israel was making for Baal were, being made or used, right, with things that were given by God. Um, Not only even in just the generic sense of like everything comes from God, right? But I mean, probably, uh, God obviously supernaturally blessed Israel uh, in a lot of different ways. I mean, economically, politically, and even agriculturally throughout the years. And then they just turn around and use that agriculture to worship Baal. Um, so it has this language of like, the same kind of language that you would have for like an animal in a zoo in verse 6. I will hedge up your way with thorns and wall her in so that she cannot find her paths, right? So, I mean, this is, in ancient days, they didn't exactly have zoos, with big concrete walls, but they would have big old walls of hedges, right? And they'd put an animal in there and hedge up their way. And, and that they were sort of captive, right? And so, obviously, in the Assyrian captivity and exile, it was similar to, okay, well, you have an animal that's sort of, four walls of hedges, they're sort of in captivity. Israel also is in captivity. Going on to B, verse 9 uses the language of marriage laws. This is another quote. It says, ancient Near Eastern marriage laws provided that an unfaithful wife could be cast out of the house by her husband without support, right? You can't exactly do that nowadays. Or I mean, there's a lot more of a legal process that kind of goes into it, at least. And in one way, that's probably a good thing. But back then, right, you prove your wife is unfaithful, you just kick her out and she's on her own. No spousal support or anything. She's just gone. And God will take back his wool and his linen and all these things that were talked about, causing Israel to be, as it says in verse 10, uncovered in the sight of her lovers. Going back to Deuteronomy 32, verse 29, it says, see now that I myself am he, there is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life, have wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand, right? And this is sorry, when I formatted this, something got messed up again, and it's throwing me off. Anyway, but just like point A, this also has been fulfilled, in part at least, during the Assyrian exile, right? Just like point A with the whole animal captivity thing, Assyrian captivity. Point B also has been fulfilled in part during the Assyrian exile. Israel was gawked at, right? Not necessarily because they were naked, not necessarily because they were unfaithful, adulterous woman kicked to the curb, but, if you hate a country, if you're enemies with the country and you see them being led off into captivity, you're probably going to laugh at them too, right? It's not a very Christian attitude to have, but put yourself in the shoes of these ancient pagans, you would probably be laughing at them as well. So Israel was gawked at when they were being led to exile. Verse 11 sort of hits you with these different festivals, and all these festivals that were listed were festivals or events that were supposed to, anyway, be centered around God and be used to worship God, right? The ones being referenced here, you have, because it says her feast days. All right. Well, there were 3 feast days, right? There was unleavened bread, which is Passover. There was harvest, or the festival of wheat, and there was the ingathering festival, or the festival of booths or tabernacles, right? You have the Festival of New Moons. That was something that occurred roughly every month. And then you have Sabbath, something that occurred every week. So you have sort of these big festivals where everyone would come and they would gather and worship. And you had like three of those a year. And then you had the little smaller thing that happened once a month. And then going down all the way to Sabbath, which happened every week. And all of these were supposed to be right centered around God and used to worship God. And now it's saying, I'm going to cause all of this to cease. God's saying he's going to cause all of this to cease. And a commentator pointed this out. I thought that this was very interesting. He asked the question, he says, what could interrupt such traditions, right? I mean, some of these feasts have been going on for centuries at this point. He says, what could interrupt it? And he answers that question, the end of the nation as a sovereign state, the end of its land and bondage, right? The exile, the captivity, that could end a lot of these festivals, at least end them in, the way that they had been going on for centuries, at least in that sense. And we see in verse 13, I will punish her for the days of the Baals to which she burned incense, decked herself with earrings and jewelry, and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, right? Once again, we see in verse 13 that these days which were supposed to be centered around God and supposed to be about worshiping God became centered around Baal, right? To Baal, they're burning incense. To Baal, they're decking themselves out with earrings and with jewelry. To Baal, going after lovers and all this. But God, it says at the end, they forgot. Going into verse 14, section C on your outline. Verse 14 uses the language of restoration and of romance. When Israel returns to her first husband, you see this in verse 7, the end of verse 7. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then it was better than it is now. So when Israel returns to her first husband, she is going to be met with judgment, right? And I know that I think I literally said this like last week or 2 weeks ago, but just because there's sort of restoration language and hope in the same chapter right after talking about judgment or captivity or something like that, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden the judgment and the punishment is negated. That doesn't mean, oh, well, actually, that's not going to happen at all. No, you're off the hook, right? And it's the same way here. When Israel returns to her first love, when Israel returns to God, she is going to be met with judgment, but eventually going to be met with restoration. And love, right? I know I've said this before, is tied into everything that God does. So it's not that, well, she's met with judgment at first, and then she's met with love, right? I mean, in some earthly sense, maybe, but in a theological sense, right? I mean, God's love is shown also in his judgment, in his punishment. But first, right, met with judgment and then met with restoration. And that's where you get a lot of the romance language. Verse 15, and I think that this is also one of your blanks, includes callbacks to the conquest of Canaan. Joshua chapter 24, verse 13 says, So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, right? So you have, I will give her vineyards, that kind of language. And then Joshua chapter 7 gives some background to this whole valley of Achor, or Achor, gives background to that whole concept. And it's kind of a little bit of a long story. But basically, this guy, you have the valley of Achor, and then you have this guy named Achan. The namings that they came up with back in these days. Achan basically rejected what God said, and he took some he took a little bit of the loot from some of the cities during the conquest. And so, right, a whole bunch of stuff happens, and Joshua's all upset. And God's like, look, go to everyone and sort this out. So Joshua lines all the guys up, and Achan, he comes forward and he says, and this is where I'm actually quoting scripture, Joshua 7. He says, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I have done. When I saw the plunder of a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and I took them." Right? This sounds so Shakespearean almost. It's very dramatic. They are hidden in the ground inside of my tent with silver underneath them. All right. So he fesses up, which is good. And he says, all that stuff that I took that I wasn't supposed to, it's all in my tent. So I'm going to basically paraphrase. They take this guy, Achan. They take the stuff they find in his tent. They bring him to the valley of Achor, which is what you see in Hosea. They stone him, and then they burn him and all the stuff that he took. Yeah, it's kind of dramatic. Verse 25 of Joshua 7 says, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today." Then all Israel stoned him, and after they stoned the rest, they burned them. And over Achan, they heaped a large pile of rocks, which remain to this day. Then the Lord turned from his fierce anger, and therefore the place has been called the Valley of Achor ever since. I mean, that is.
But they stoned all of his family too?
It says they stoned him, and after that they stoned the rest. So yeah, I'm assuming that means the rest of the people that knew about it or were complacent in it.
His oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent,
Yeah.
and all that he had. You need to go back and read that sometime.
I've read that a long time.
It's been a while.
What was that, Joshua?
7,
Yeah, that's 7.
7:10.
Yeah, that narrative I think runs through probably the end of the chapter, I would imagine. It's kind of a long.
It starts, in his Bible, it starts the sin of Achan on verse 10 and goes to the end of the chapter.
It's kind of long for just sort of a one-off little narrative like that.
If
But
they did a thief like that today, there wouldn't be very many thieves.
this is true. This is a factual statement. I don't even know that.
The word stone means a different thing now.
Oh, you think so? I don't think so.
I don't even have a response to that. Thank you. So why is this appearing in Hosea? We have the verse 15. I will give her vineyards, right? That's sort of similar language to what we saw in Joshua, very blessing promise like. And then it also says, the valley of Achor as a door of hope. She shall sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the days when she came up from the land of Egypt. I don't know about you, but when I read Joshua, I don't exactly get Valley of Hope from that narrative. So what's going on, right? God's basically saying he's going to flip the entire situation on its head, right? The places and the things that Israel is presently in the time of Hosea using for idol worship, right? It's going to be given back to Israel as a blessing. And it's going to be used for true worship, right? Valley of Achor, I mean, that was, to us in our 21st century Western mindset, we're like, that punishment doesn't really fit the crime. But to God, I mean, that was a very terrible offense that Achan did by not only stealing, but I mean, lying about it, and also his sin caused trouble for the rest of Israel and put a lot of what they were trying to do at the time in jeopardy. So it was a really big deal. And this place, it doesn't exactly have a lot of. It doesn't necessarily bring back a lot of happy memories. If you're in Hosea's time and someone talks about that, you're not exactly going to remember fondly your family vacation to the Valley of Achor. Right? You're probably gonna cringe a little bit, and you're gonna wish that they hadn't brought that up. But God's gonna flip the entire thing on its head. And right, the site of one of Israel's worst mistakes now is going to be used to bless Israel. Israel is going to, it says, sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the days when she came up from the land of Egypt, right? But once again, right, all of this only comes about after judgment. It only comes after exile, after destruction, after destitution, right, being kicked to the curb, like I talked about. And really, like we talked about last week, this only comes in full during the Messianic era. And we'll sort of get into that later tonight and also just later on in the book of Hosea. So, jumping into verse 16. And it shall be in that day, says the Lord, that you will call me my husband, and no longer call me my master. For I will take from her mouth the name of the Baals, and they shall be remembered by their name no more. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the air, with the creeping things on the ground. Bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth, to make them lie down safely. I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, in loving kindness and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. It shall come to pass in that day that I will answer, says the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. The earth shall answer with grain, with new wine, and with oil. They shall answer Jezreel. Then I will sow her for myself in the earth, and I will have mercy on her who had not obtained mercy. Then I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people. And they shall say, you are my God. So, I think this is your blank. What's really interesting is that the two words that in the New King James anyway are translated as husband and master both mean husband, essentially. Different ways to think about being a husband. You have 16. Okay, yeah. It shall be in that day, says the Lord, that you will call me my husband. And then you can also literally just translate it and no longer call me my husband. But they're functioning in different ways. And your fill in the blank is the second word also means Baal. Right? And literally, I mean, if you were to sort of just transliterate that word, not worry about, what does this actually mean? What is the English equivalent of this? But just, okay, this is the Hebrew letter for B. This is the Hebrew letter for whatever, right? It would transliterate out as Baal, essentially. And so, going back to the first idea, though, right, that both of these words can mean husband, right? One of them is husband, probably more as we would think of it today, right? Husband, wife, you get married, you love each other, that kind of a thing. And the second word that I said can also mean husband. It's more husband in the sense of, because it's translated here as master, it's a pretty good idea, right? Husband in terms of headship, right? I mean, especially in those days, a husband almost was the owner of his wife, even in some legal senses sometimes. So it's more of that sense. And so it's basically saying, right, no longer is this going to be, a relationship, a married relationship of, like, I own you, I'm ruling over you, but one of love, one more like we would think of in terms of today when we use the word husband. But going to the second idea, that the second word translated master can also mean Baal, right? No longer will Israel call upon Baal as her husband or as her master, right? But Israel's going to call upon God, because this whole thing, right? It's all metaphorical or allegorical or what have you of, well, Israel is like an adulterous woman, right? Left her first love, went out, messed up, messed around, and, eventually finds her way back to her first love, her first husband. And so, right, like a adulterous woman who has an affair and is calling her new man her husband, right, that's what Israel was doing. She was going to Baal and calling Baal God, right, calling Baal the master. But now, right, it's gonna flip, it's gonna reverse, and instead of calling Baal master or God, she's gonna call Yahweh God, right? And this is another one of your blanks. The covenant that God makes, talking specifically in verse 18, in the day I will make a covenant for them. It uses both biblical and extra biblical language. The biblical language, if you're really looking for it, you can probably pick it up without me even pointing out. But it says he makes a covenant with the beasts of the fields, the birds of the air, and the creeping things. And this is the same order that's found in the creation narrative of Genesis 1. That's another one of your blanks, I believe. Yes, the same order found in the creation narrative of Genesis chapter 1, right? In the day that I create the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, and, I think the King James translated every creepy thing that creeps on the ground, right? And I got to agree, because some of the things that creep on the ground, they are pretty creepy, right? They're pretty gross.
Creepy crawly.
Creepy crawly. And it's the same order. So just as God, he promised to bring Israel back to her days of singing after the Exodus and, restoring her agricultural stuff, right? Now he's promising to bring Israel back to sort of the time of the Garden of Eden, right? This universal peace almost. Peace with the land, peace with the animals, peace with each other. And right, what's interesting is God doesn't make a covenant with Israel, but he makes a covenant for Israel. Think back to when we were in Zechariah. Did you say something?
No,
Sorry. Think back to Zechariah when he was playing the part of the shepherd, and he had the two staffs, and one of the staffs or rods that he broke was sort of God's protective covenant with other nations in order to protect Judah, right? And that's kind of the same thing here, right? It's not necessarily a covenant in the same way of like the Abrahamic covenant or the Mosaic covenant or the covenant with Noah, right? Where God specifically came down and made a covenant with Israel. But he's actually making a covenant for Israel. And the idea here is it's for Israel in the sake that he wants to bless Israel. And he wants to sort of bring Israel back into this time of peace like there was when God first created the world. B, on your outline, this is talking about the sort of extra biblical language. Similarly, ancient treaties often listed attacks from animals, as well as the obvious, war, attack from humans, listed attacks from animals as punishment for a nation failing to uphold their end of the bargain, right? So, say I'm an independent nation, the nation of Parker, and there's also the nation of Wilma. And we make a treaty, and we say, okay, well, we won't attack you if you give us, 10,000 silver paid every year. But if you don't, not only will we go to war with you, but also may all of the animals attack you, or something like that. Right? I don't know how often it was that animals would randomly maul people for not holding their end of ancient treaties, but it is kind of the same language, and this was often sort of a punishment, whether realized or not, that was used in these treaties, basically threatening, okay, if you don't keep your end of the deal, here's what's going to happen. And so God promises that, right, this isn't going to happen in the future. Not only do we have the language at the end of 15, sorry, not 15, the end of 18, of, right, bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth. So, right, not only do we have the language of human to human war being done away with, but we also have the language of, right, I will make a covenant with the beast of the fields, the bird of the air, the creeping things, right? You have the language of these animals, and there's going to be peace there as well, right? God promises that these attacks aren't going to happen in the future. And in the Messianic age, right, humanity's end of the covenant, so to speak, it has been upheld, right? Where the old covenant was completely fulfilled through Jesus Christ. So we're no longer under threat of condemnation for failing to live up to God's standard, if we have faith in Jesus Christ, that is, of course. We actually do see sort of the final fulfillment of this anyway in the Messianic age once again. Finally, the last three verses, 21, 22, 23, we have some more blessings that are promised, followed by a reference to Jezreel. Now, this is another one of your blanks. Jezreel literally means God will sow. And immediately after this, in verse 23, God promises that he will sow her for myself in the earth. He will sow Israel in the earth for himself. And we talked about sort of the whole idea behind Jezreel in chapter 1 of the fall of the house of Jehu and his dynasty. And so after, the fall of the house of Jehu, and after the Assyrian conquest, and after the exile, and after all of the sort of economic and agricultural tragedies that are going to occur, now, or, for Hosea's audience, in the future, after all of that, God's going to sow Israel in the earth. That's one of your points. God will sow Israel in the earth, and he will give stability, right? Which is the complete opposite of all of the stuff that I just listed, right? I mean, the fall of the house of Jehu, right? How many of y'all, well, all of y'all, right? I mean, y'all were all alive, like, during the JFK assassination, right? Yeah.
Yep.
I'm a youngin'. Right? Would you say that was a time of political stability in the United States? No, right? And it's the same way.
Not at all.
It's the same way with the House of Jehu prophecy, right? It needs to happen, and it did happen, but it didn't exactly give political stability to Israel, right? The conquest and the exile, right? That was not a time of stability at all, right? 1 minute I'm at my home, my wife is, planting her garden, my kids are out in the street doing whatever, and the next minute we're all being carted off to some foreign land in exile, right? Not a time of stability. All of the economic and the agricultural disasters that had to happen before the blessings being talked about now. I mean, that obviously was not a time of stability either. But now, right, God is going to sow Israel into the earth, and this brings about stability, right? Similar to how the names of the Baals, it says it's going to be taken from Israel's mouth, right? for Israel, Jezreel, it's no longer going to be associated with death and destruction, right? Because the whole Valley of Jezreel thing. I mean that was a valley of bloodshed, on multiple occasions. But I mean, in this, for Hosea's audience, in this future time, just how, okay, well, the word, the names of the Baals are going to be taken from our mouths, right? That's not going to be anywhere in our minds at all. We're just going to be focused on God, right? The word or the name Jezreel, right, in terms of death and destruction and bloodshed, that's not going to be anywhere in their minds, right? Jezreel is going to be associated with, right, the earth trencher with grain, with new wine, with oil, with being sown for God in the earth, right? That's what they're going to think of when they hear Jezreel. But, right, in verse 23, we also have mention of Lo Ruhama and Lo Ami, right? No mercy, no compassion, and not my people. And once again, I mean, this is all pointing towards a full fulfillment during the Messianic age, because that ultimately was an age of peace, right? I mean, going on into the church age, I mean, they kind of are the same thing, kind of not. I mean, even now, I mean, we're living in the age of peace, the age of mercy, and ultimately the age of stability. Not necessarily, right, in earthly sense, right? But certainly peace with God. I mean, that was like literally the first thing that was said when Jesus Christ was born is, right, peace on earth, goodwill to men, right? Peace between God and man, right? This has been a really long time, but I preached a sermon, either Joshua or no, it was probably Judges. It was in Judges, and right, because it was sort of, you have all these judges, and they, they'll rule, and Israel is faithful, and it will be a time of peace, and then they die, and just as soon as they get that judge buried, Israel goes back to being idolatrous, to being unfaithful, and they're thrown into war, and they have some foreign nation ruling over them, right? And my whole sort of application for that was, right, full peace with God came with Jesus Christ. And it's the same sort of idea here in Hosea as well. I mean, this sort of prophesied peace and prophesied stability ultimately came with Jesus Christ. Verse 23, I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people, and they shall say, you are my God. I mean, we have been adopted now as the children of God, people who formerly, under normal circumstances would not be considered the people of God. We have been into that family. And because of that, I mean, we are living in an age of spiritual peace and spiritual stability. So anyway, that was chapter 2. Any questions or anything about that? All right, then I'll turn it over for prayer time.